Have you ever looked at someone you loved and realized they were no longer seeing you as family, only as the last thing standing between them and what they wanted? Stay with me because this night changed everything. And before we begin, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Have you ever realized a loved one saw you only as a bank account? Tell me your story below. I'm Robert. I lay on mahogany I'd hand-polished, tasting iron. My son Tyler looked down like I was an outdated asset. Madison sneered. No one believes a senile man who trips Robert. You should have signed. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. My ribs were screaming, but my mind was a cold balance sheet. Tyler thought the blood on the floor made me a liability, but to me it was just a final entry in a ledger I'd been keeping for months. He stood over me, his face twisted in a smirk that looked like a bad investment. I reached for my phone, my fingers scraping against the mahogany planks I'd laid down 30 years ago. Every inch I moved felt like a transaction of pure pain, but I didn't hesitate. Tyler didn't stop me. He actually laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed through the library. Go ahead, Dad, he sneered, looking at Madison for approval. Call whoever you want. Tell them you're confused. Tell them you fell. He thought his narrative was ironclad. He thought he'd cornered a weak old man who had run out of equity. He was wrong. I wasn't reactive. I was proactive. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I didn't call 911. I pressed the only shortcut I'd programmed into my phone 3 weeks earlier. When the line clicked open, I didn't waste words on emotion. I didn't say I was hurt. I didn't say my own son had just assaulted me in the house I'd built for him. I simply said 2 words. It happened. Then I ended the call and let the phone drop. Tyler's laugh faltered, just for a millisecond. Who was that? He asked, his tone turning clipped. I didn't answer. I went back to my internal accounting. For 30 years, I'd been the primary stakeholder in this family. I had sacrificed vacations, worked double shifts at the woodworking shop, and breathed in sawdust until my lungs burned, just to ensure Tyler had a premium start in life. I remembered the nights when the winter wind whipped through the workshop and I'd stay until 3 in the morning just to finish a client's cabinet so Tyler's tuition check wouldn't bounce. I remembered the first suit. I bought him $2,200. I'd worked 6 weeks of overtime for that suit so he could walk into a real estate office looking like a success. I'd funded his lifestyle, his education, and even the down payment on the condo he and Madison currently occupied. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, never realizing that to them, my love was just a subscription they expected me to foot the bill for. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. But tonight, the credit line was closed. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. This betrayal didn't catch me off guard. It only validated the strategic retreat I'd been planning since they started asking about the deeds and the trust accounts. I looked up at Tyler and Madison. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only shocked that I'd stopped playing along. My silence wasn't a decline, it was preparation. I wasn't a victim on the floor. I was the architect of a fortress that was about to come alive. I didn't need him to believe me. I just needed the clock to keep ticking. I kept wondering, why did I let it go this far? Why did I let them turn my sanctuary into a boardroom for my own eviction? The hallways of this Chicago brownstone smelled like floor wax and old memories, but Tyler only smelled commission. He's a real estate broker who traded his soul for high-interest debt and bad gambles, and he looked at this $4,500,000 home not as a legacy, but as a liquidation event. Every time he and Madison visited lately, they didn't ask about my back or the game. They walked around with a laser measure, calculating what they called optimizing floor area. They spoke about my basement woodworking shop like it was wasted square footage, an inventory of memories that needed to be cleared for a higher return on investment. I sat through their presentations, watching them flip through folders that treated my life's work like a distressed asset. The truth is, I was a prisoner in a house without bars. I was trapped in a prison of hope, holding onto a ghost while the living were trying to bury me. I saw my late wife in the curve of Tyler's jaw and the way he narrowed his eyes when he was focused. I convinced myself that if I just gave him enough equity, enough space, enough of my own dignity, the son she loved would eventually return. I was trying to restore a rotten piece of timber, thinking if I just sanded it down deep enough, I'd find the solid core Sarah had believed in. But some rot goes all the way through the grain. You can't polish a betrayal until it looks like loyalty, and you can't restore a heart that has turned into a calculator. I had spent years being the survivor, thinking my endurance was a virtue, a silent tribute to a family that had already dissolved. I didn't realize that by absorbing his cruelty, I was just funding his next attack. I had become a human safety net for a man who enjoyed watching me fall, thinking my love was a commodity he could exploit without consequence. Looking at him now, standing over me with that expensive Parker pen I gave him for graduation, I finally saw the bottom of the ledger. He wasn't Sarah's legacy. He was just a bad debt I was done paying. My endurance wasn't strength anymore. It was an overhead cost I was cutting effective immediately. The invisible chains of being a survivor had finally snapped. And for the first time in years, I wasn't seeing a son on the edge of a mistake. I was seeing a predator who had finally run out of time. Tyler and Madison didn't like the silence. 5 minutes had passed since my call, and the lack of sirens was making them bold. Madison stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply on the mahogany floorboards, the same planks I had spent 40 hours hand sanding into a mirror finish 30 years ago. She stopped inches from my face. She didn't look down with pity. She looked down with the cold irritation of an investor dealing with a non-performing asset. She dropped the new folder onto the floor, right into the pool of my blood. It wasn't just the house papers this time, it was a total liquidation of my woodworking business. Everything, the shop, the tools, the client list I'd built over 30 years of 12-hour days. Sign it, Robert, she whispered, her voice like a razor. The house, the shop, the warehouse, we're doing this for your own safety. Tyler crouched down beside her, holding the silver Parker pen I'd bought him for his graduation. It was weighted perfectly, a piece of engineering I'd admired when I bought it for him. Now I clicked it with a sharp rhythmic sound that echoed like a clock counting down my life. Look at you, Dad. You're bleeding on the floor. You're clearly confused. You're a danger to yourself, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. The gaslighting was systematic. They had spent months building this fiction, the story of a senile old man who couldn't remember where he put his keys, let alone how to run a $4,500,000 estate. Everyone thinks you're losing it, Tyler continued, his voice rising into a growl. The neighbors have noticed you talking to yourself. Your clients have been calling me, worried about their orders. You're a liability to the family legacy. He called me a liability, yet he never paused to wonder how the $80,000 annual tax bill on this $4,500,000 estate was paid on time every single year without his help. He pressed the pen into my shaking hand, but I didn't close my fingers. I looked at the silver barrel of the pen. I'd worked 6 weeks of overtime at the shipyard to pay for that gift. Madison's patience finally snapped when I didn't respond. She ground the sharp toe of her stiletto into my bruised ribs. I felt the air leave my lungs in a ragged gasp, but I kept my eyes on Tyler. Sign the papers, you old fool, Tyler screamed. Sign them and we can get you into that luxury nursing home in the North Shore. It costs $110,000 a year, Robert. You'll have a view of the lake and a private nurse. It's better than dying alone in a heap of wood shavings. If you don't sign, I call the state authorities. I'll have you committed to a public ward before the sun comes up. You'll never see this house again. They were vultures. Picking at what they thought was a carcass, they saw a beaten man, but I was just a recording device. They had walked right past the property under 2.4, our audio and video surveillance sign at the gate, a simple warning that stripped them of any legal expectation of privacy. Their arrogance was their own undoing. I needed them to confirm their intent one last time. If I sign this, Tyler, will the $2 million you drained from your mother's trust finally be enough to satisfy you? I whispered, ensuring my phone, still active on the floor, captured every word of his response. I needed the intelligent son to show his true face before the fortress opened its gates. I didn't sign. I just watched the headlights sweep across the ceiling. The sound of the front door hitting the wall was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in years. It was a heavy, percussive crack that signaled the end of Tyler's reign of terror. Uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department poured into the room, their flashlights cutting through the shadows where Madison had been hiding. Then came Marcus, my attorney. He walked in with his overcoat still open, looking less like an attorney and more like an executioner holding a leather portfolio. Tyler scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of panicked confusion. "What is this? This is a private family matter. My father had a fall. We're just trying to help him." He tried to sound like the polished broker again, but his voice cracked on the word help. Marcus didn't even look at him. He walked straight to me and knelt down, checking the blood on my temple. "Robert, is it done?" The lead detective gave a sharp nod to the paramedics, allowing me a brief window to confirm the site's security. In cases of elder exploitation, the victim's immediate clarity can be more vital than a hospital bed, and I wasn't going anywhere until the ledger was closed. A paramedic from the ambulance waiting outside pressed a cold compress to my head, urging me to stay still, but I pushed through the pain. My ribs were screaming, but I wasn't leaving until the audit was complete. I looked him in the eye and nodded. I wasn't a beaten old man anymore. I was the client who had authorized the strike. I pushed myself up with the detective's help, sitting on the couch I'd once hand carved for Sarah. Marcus stepped forward, acting as the designated custodian of the forensic file we had built with the district attorney's office over the last month. He wasn't just my lawyer tonight, he was the primary witness for the financial crimes division. "Every signature you tried to force tonight, Tyler, is a worthless piece of ink," Marcus said, standing up and turning toward my son. His voice was cold, factual, and lethal. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Miller restructured his entire legal identity. This Chicago brownstone, the woodworking business, and every liquid asset he owns were moved into an irrevocable trust. He no longer owns them as an individual, which means he couldn't sign them away to you even if he wanted to. "You've been pressuring a ghost." Madison's face went white. She looked at the folder on the floor, now soaked in iron-scented blood. "That's impossible. We checked the filings." "You checked the old filings," Marcus replied, pulling a stack of certified documents from his bag. "We utilized a statutory holding period and a private entity transfer that doesn't hit the public registrar for 30 days. You were looking at a mirror of the past, Tyler, while the real assets were already moved into a blind trust. We worked through the nights to ensure the fortress was locked before you ever stepped foot on this porch. But that's not why the detectives are here." The room went deathly still, the kind of stillness that comes when the criminal realization finally hits the bone. Marcus reached into a side pocket and pulled out a series of forensic audit reports. "We didn't just protect what Robert has now. We looked into what happened to his wife's legacy. Sarah Miller had a private trust meant for her grandchildren, a fund totaling $2,200,000. Tyler took a step back, his eyes darting toward the door. "The signatures authorizing the total withdrawal of those funds 4 years ago were meticulous," Marcus continued, his eyes locked on Tyler. "But they weren't Sarah's. We've had 3 handwriting experts and a digital forensic team analyze the transfers. You and Madison forged your mother's name to pay off your gambling debts and your failing real estate margins. You didn't just want this house tonight. You were trying to hide the fact that you already stole $2,200,000 from this family's future. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was a felony." The criminal twist turned the air in the room into lead. Tyler looked at his hands, as if he could still see the ink from the forgery. Madison tried to step away, but an officer was already blocking her path. The narrative they'd built, the story of the senile father and the caring children, had been incinerated by the truth. I looked at my son and didn't see a boy I'd taught to ride a bike. I saw the final, ugly audit of a failed life. Tyler's legs didn't just buckle, they surrendered. He hit the mahogany floor with a heavy thud, his knees landing exactly where my blood had been pooling moments before. It was a percussive kind of collapse, the sound of a man realizing his entire future had been an architectural drawing built on sand. He looked up at me, but the triumphant gaze was gone, replaced by a naked, trembling panic that made him look smaller than he'd ever been in his 32 years. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "We can fix this. I was stressed. The market is down. I didn't mean to hurt you." I didn't answer right away. I adjusted myself in the armchair, the pain in my ribs, now a dull, steady throb that felt like a reminder of why I was here. I watched him, and I realized I was witnessing what I call the empty wallet illusion. For years, Tyler had moved through Chicago with the arrogance of a king, wearing $2,000 suits and driving a car that cost more than my first workshop. He thought that power was his, but it was actually just a cloak he'd rented with my equity. People like Tyler and Madison often confuse having with being. They believe the numbers in a bank account are a measurement of their soul's worth. When those numbers were high, they felt entitled to play God with my life. But the moment Marcus revealed that the accounts were locked, that the $2,200,000 they'd stolen from Sarah's trust was now a lead weight around their necks, their entire personalities began to dissolve. Without the having, there was no being. Tyler's confidence was a luxury item he could no longer afford. He was a non-performing asset in a room full of auditors. Madison was still trying to negotiate, her eyes darting between the officers and Marcus. I had no idea about the forgery, she lied, her voice high and shrill. Tyler told me it was an inheritance. I'm a victim here too. Tyler didn't even look at her. He was too busy staring at the silver Parker pen that had rolled away across the floor. The same pen he'd used to try and force my signature was now just a piece of evidence in a room that had become a courtroom. This isn't a negotiation, Madison, Marcus said, his voice flat as a grave. The police have the digital trail. They have the expert testimony. And they have the recording from the security system, mister. Miller installed last month. I reached into the side pocket of my robe and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I leaned forward, ignoring the fire in my side, and held it out. Tyler reached for it with shaking fingers, probably hoping it was a pardon. He opened it, and his face turned grey. It's a formal notice of eviction, I said. My voice was cold, factual, and finally free of the burden of hope. The apartment you're living in is owned by my company. You have 48 hours to vacate. After that, the locks will be changed. Since the unit is registered as a corporate executive suite and not a standard residential lease, your violation of the conduct clause terminates your occupancy effective immediately. Dad, where will we go? Tyler gasped. I'm facing charges. I have nothing. You should have thought about the overhead costs of betrayal before you opened the line of credit, I told him. I spent 30 years being the silent investor in your life. I'm done footing the bill. As the officers stepped forward to read them their rights, I didn't look away. I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut on Tyler's wrists. I watched Madison lose her composure entirely, screaming about her reputation as she was led toward the door. The finisher wasn't the police, it was the silence they left behind. I sat in my house on the furniture I'd built, and for the first time in 4 years, the balance sheet was perfectly even. The house is quiet now. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave, but the deep, settled stillness of a forest after a storm has passed. I sat in my library, the amber lights of Chicago beginning to twinkle through the window like scattered embers. The room smelled of linseed oil and beeswax, the familiar sense of my trade finally reclaiming the air from the metallic tang of betrayal. I stood up, moving slowly because my ribs still reminded me of the price of clarity, and walked toward the center of the room. I got down on one knee, a bucket of warm water and a soft cloth beside me. I began to scrub the dark, dried stain on the mahogany. It was slow work, painful work, but it was the most important restoration of my life. As I wiped away the last traces of that night, I realized I wasn't just cleaning a floor. I was performing a final act of service for my own soul. I had spent 30 years building a house for a family that didn't exist, and tonight I was finally reclaiming the foundation for myself. The $2,200,000 we recovered from the forgery was already being moved. I didn't want it back in my personal accounts. It felt weighted with Sarah's grief. Instead, Marcus helped me establish the Miller Foundation for Elder Protection. It would provide legal and financial resources for people like me, those who spend their golden years being treated as a harvest for the greedy. It was Sarah's real legacy, a gift that would protect thousands of futures instead of funding one son's failed gambles. I've come to realize that cutting off a toxic relationship isn't an act of hate. It's the ultimate act of self-respect. For a long time, I believed that family meant sacrifice without limits. I thought my endurance was proof of my love, but I was wrong. By accepting Tyler's cruelty, I was simply teaching him that my dignity had no value. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that blood is a connection, not a contract for abuse. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their own choices alone. Forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the prison of hoping they will change. I have forgiven myself for being a father who loved too much, and I have forgiven Tyler by handing him over to the justice he earned. The fortress is locked, and for the first time in years, I am the only one who holds the key. I am Robert Miller, not a victim, not a burden, but a man who stood his ground and found peace in the grain of the truth. If Robert's story helped you realize that your patience has value and your boundaries deserve protection, please hit like and share this video with those who might be fighting in silence. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next journeys into justice. Justice might arrive late, but with the right preparation, it will be absolute. Thank you for listening.